The axe came down in the darkness, and no one heard the screams. On that freezing March night in 1922, something unspeakable happened on a remote Bavarian farmstead. Something so disturbing that even a century later, investigators still can't explain it. 6 people were brutally murdered in their own home, but here's what makes your blood run cold. Someone had been living in their house for days before the killings, watching them, waiting. And what the police discovered when they finally arrived would haunt an entire nation for generations. But before we dive into one of the most terrifying unsolved mysteries in European history, let me ask you something. What would you do if you heard footsteps in your attic? What if you found strange tracks in the snow leading to your house but not away from it? Would you investigate? Or would you run? The family at Hinterkaifeck didn't run. Maybe they should have. The Gruber family seemed ordinary enough. Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old farmer, had worked the land at Hinterkaifeck for decades. The farm itself sat about 45 miles north of Munich, so isolated that the nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. It was the kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear you. Andreas lived there with his wife, Cecilia, who was 72 and growing frail with age. Their daughter Victoria had moved back home after her husband, Karl Gabriel, died in the First World War, though rumors swirled through the village that Karl might not have died in the trenches at all. Some whispered that he deserted, that he was still alive somewhere, hiding from the authorities. Victoria had brought her 2 children with her, 7-year-old Cecilia, named after her grandmother, and 2-year-old Joseph. The household was completed by their maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only been working at the farm for 6 months. She'd replaced the previous maid who had quit abruptly, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. She said she heard footsteps in the attic at night, voices whispering through the walls when everyone was supposed to be asleep. The family had laughed it off. Old houses made strange noises, they said. There was nothing to fear. But Maria Baumgartner would never get the chance to decide if the house was haunted or not. She would die on her very first day of work. Let me take you back to the days before the murders, because this is where the real horror begins. This is where you start to realize that whoever killed the Gruber family wasn't some random drifter passing through. This was planned, calculated, and the killer had been preparing for a very long time. 6 months before the murders, in September 1921, the previous maid gave her notice. She was terrified, though she couldn't quite explain why. She told neighbors in the village that she'd heard strange sounds coming from the attic. Footsteps when everyone was in bed, the creak of floorboards above her room in the dead of night. Once, she swore she heard breathing on the other side of her door, but when she opened it, the hallway was empty. The other servants in the village told her she was imagining things, that old farmhouses were full of rats and settling timbers. But she knew what she'd heard. She knew someone, or something, was in that house with them. Andreas Gruber had dismissed her fears. He was a practical man, hardened by years of working the land. He didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. But even Andreas couldn't ignore what happened next. It started in late March, just days before the murders. Andreas was checking the property when he noticed something odd in the snow. Footprints. They led from the forest edge toward the barn, clear as day in the fresh powder. Andreas followed them, his breath misting in the cold air, and his stomach dropped. The tracks led right up to the barn door and then stopped. There were no tracks leading away. Whoever had made them had gone into the barn and never come out, or they'd somehow erased their tracks behind them. Andrea stood there in the snow, staring at those impossible footprints. And for the first time in years, he felt genuine fear. He searched the barn thoroughly, pitchfork in hand, checking every corner, every shadow. He found nothing. No one. Just empty stalls and the musty smell of hay. But the footprints were real. Someone had been there. He didn't tell his family about the footprints, not wanting to worry them. But over the next few days, more strange things happened. Andreas found a newspaper in the house that no one in the family had purchased. It was from Munich, dated recently, and it was lying on the kitchen table when he came in from the fields. When he asked his wife and daughter about it, they both looked at him like he was mad. Neither of them had bought a newspaper. Neither of them had been to Munich. Then there was the matter of the keys. The house key went missing from its usual hook by the door. Andreas tore the place apart looking for it, certain that one of the children must have taken it. But it never turned up. He had a new key made in the village, but the old one was gone. Someone had taken it. Someone now had a way into their house. The night before the murders, Andreas heard something that made his blood run cold. He was lying in bed, Cecilia snoring softly beside him when he heard it. Footsteps, clear, deliberate footsteps coming from directly above his bedroom, from the attic. Andreas lay there in the darkness, his heart hammering in his chest, and listened. The footsteps moved slowly across the attic floor, from one end to the other, then back again. Someone was pacing up there. Someone was in his house. Andreas grabbed the lamp from his bedside table and crept out of bed. He made his way through the dark house to the attic stairs, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the lamp steady. The stairs creaked under his weight, each step an agony of suspense. When he reached the attic door, he paused, pressing his ear against the wood. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. He turned the handle and pushed the door open, holding the lamp high. The attic was empty, completely, utterly empty. Just old furniture covered in dusty sheets and boxes of forgotten belongings. No one was there. No one could have been there. But Andreas knew what he'd heard. Someone had been pacing in this room just moments ago. He searched every corner, moving aside furniture, checking behind the boxes. Nothing. But as he was about to leave, something caught his eye. In the dust on the floor there were marks, scuff marks, as if someone had been lying down. And next to them the dust had been disturbed in a pattern that looked disturbingly like the impression of a hand. Andreas didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen with his hunting rifle across his knees, watching the ceiling, listening for any sound from above. But there was nothing. Just silence. The terrible waiting silence before a storm. The next morning, Friday, March 31st, Andreas told his neighbor about the strange occurrences. This detail would later prove crucial, because it meant that at least one person knew something was wrong at Hinterkaifeck before the murders occurred. Andreas didn't go into detail, but he mentioned the footprints in the snow and the sounds in the attic. His neighbor suggested calling the police, but Andreas refused. He was a proud man, and he didn't want to look foolish if there turned out to be a simple explanation. Maybe it was just some vagrant using the barn for shelter, he reasoned. Maybe the sounds in the attic were just rats after all. But Andreas knew better. Deep down he knew something was terribly wrong. And that evening when darkness fell over Hinterkaifeck, his worst fears would be realized. Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm that Friday afternoon. She was 44 years old, a devout Catholic who had recently left a position in Munich to take this job in the countryside. She'd been told the last maid had left because of superstitious fears, but Maria didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in hard work and honest wages. As she walked up the path to the farmhouse, carrying her small suitcase, she had no idea she was walking toward her death. Victoria greeted Maria at the door with a warm smile. She showed the new maid to her room and gave her a brief tour of the house. Everything seemed normal, pleasant even. The family was preparing for the evening, and Maria was told she could settle in before starting her duties the next morning. She unpacked her few belongings, hung her coat on the hook behind her door, and went to the kitchen to introduce herself to the rest of the family. Little Kazilia, the 7-year-old, was playing with a doll in the corner. 2-year-old Joseph was already asleep in his crib. Andreas was out in the barn doing the evening feeding. Old Chazilia, the grandmother, was sitting by the fire, knitting. It was a scene of perfect domestic tranquility. But somewhere in that house, hidden in the shadows, someone was watching. Someone was waiting. What happened next can only be pieced together from the evidence found later, but the timeline of horror goes something like this. As dusk fell, Andreas went out to the barn to feed the animals and lock up for the night. This was his routine, something he did every evening without fail. Victoria went with him, probably to help with the heavy work. Little Kazilia, ever curious and eager to help her grandfather, followed them out into the gathering darkness. They never made it back to the house. Here's what investigators believe happened, and I warn you, this is where the story becomes almost unbearably dark. As Andreas, Victoria, and young Kazilia walked from the house to the barn, someone was waiting for them. Someone who had been hiding in the property, possibly for days, watching their routines, learning their patterns. Someone who knew exactly when they would be alone and vulnerable. The killer struck in the barn. They used a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe, and they attacked from behind. Andreas was hit first, the heavy blade crushing his skull. He died instantly, his body crumpling to the barn floor. Victoria saw what was happening and tried to run, but the killer was faster. She was struck down just feet from her father, the mattock splitting her skull open. She fell face first into the straw, blood pooling around her head. And then there was little Kazilia, the 7-year-old girl who had just wanted to help her grandfather with the evening chores. What must have gone through her mind in those final moments? Did she try to run? Did she scream for help, her small voice lost in the vast Bavarian countryside where no one could hear? The evidence suggests she was struck down next to her mother, her small body found lying in the blood-soaked straw. But here's what makes this even more horrifying. Little Kazilia didn't die immediately. The autopsy would later reveal that she survived for hours after the attack, lying in the barn, wounded and terrified, slowly dying in the darkness. She had torn out clumps of her own hair in her agony, the strands found clutched in her small fists. And the killer knew she was still alive. They knew, and they left her there to suffer. With 3 members of the family dead or dying in the barn, the killer turned their attention to the house. Old Cecilia, the grandmother, was probably in her bedroom by this time, preparing for bed. Maria Baumgartner, on her first day of work, was likely in her room as well, perhaps writing a letter home to tell her family about her new position. And in his crib, 2-year-old Joseph slept peacefully, unaware of the nightmare that was unfolding around him. The killer entered the house. They knew the layout, knew exactly where everyone would be. They climbed the stairs to the bedrooms, the mattock still dripping with blood. Old Cecilia was murdered in her bed, struck down as she slept. The force of the blow was so severe that fragments of her skull were embedded in the wall behind the bed. Maria Baumgartner must have heard something. Perhaps she heard the grandmother's death, or maybe she heard footsteps in the hallway. She had time to get partially out of bed, the investigators would later note, suggesting she was trying to flee when the killer burst into her room. She was struck down in her nightgown, her body falling across the bed, blood soaking into the mattress. She had been at Hinterkaifeck for less than 6 hours. And then there was Joseph, the 2-year-old baby, sleeping in his crib. What kind of monster murders a baby? What kind of evil drives someone to that point? But the killer showed no mercy. Little Joseph was suffocated in his crib, his small life snuffed out without ceremony. In the space of perhaps 30 minutes, the entire Gruber family and their maid had been wiped out. 6 people, including 2 young children, brutally murdered in their own home. But here's where the story takes a turn that makes it even more disturbing, even more impossible to understand. The killer didn't leave. In the days following the murders, neighbors noticed smoke coming from the farmhouse chimney. They saw lights in the windows at night. The farm animals were being fed and cared for. Someone was living at Hinterkaifeck, going about daily life as if nothing had happened, while 6 corpses lay rotting in the barn and the house. The killer had stayed. They had stayed for days, maybe even up to a week, living among the bodies, eating the Gruber's food, sleeping in their beds. Try to imagine that for a moment. Try to wrap your mind around someone who could murder an entire family, including children, and then calmly sit down to eat their food. Who could sleep in their house, feed their animals, keep the fires burning, while the bodies of their victims lay just a few feet away. What kind of person could do that? What kind of mind could conceive of such actions? The question that haunts investigators even today is simple. Why? Why would someone stay at the scene of such horrific crimes? What possible reason could there be? Some have suggested the killer was hiding from authorities and needed shelter. Others believe the killer was mentally ill, disconnected from reality. But the most chilling theory is that the killer stayed because they could, because they wanted to experience what it felt like to occupy the Grubers' lives, to live in their space, to possess what had been theirs. It wasn't until Tuesday, April 4th, 4 days after the murders, that anyone realized something was seriously wrong. The villagers had noticed the absence of the Gruber family from church on Sunday, but that wasn't unusual enough to raise immediate alarm. Andreas wasn't particularly religious, and he often skipped services when there was work to be done on the farm. But when young Cecilia didn't show up for school on Monday or Tuesday, the teacher grew concerned. The teacher mentioned it to some of the neighbors, and they remembered that Andreas had spoken about strange occurrences at the farm. A group of men decided to investigate. They made the trek out to Hinterkaifeck on that Tuesday afternoon, calling out as they approached the farm. No one answered. The house was silent, but smoke was coming from the chimney, and the barn doors were closed, suggesting someone was home. The men entered the barn first, and what they found there would give them nightmares for the rest of their lives. 3 bodies lay in the straw, partially covered with hay. Andreas, Victoria, and little Cecilia. Their skulls crushed, their blood dried black on the barn floor. The little girl's hands were still clutching strands of her own hair. The men stumbled back out of the barn, retching, their minds struggling to process what they had seen. One of them ran to get the police while the others, despite their horror, forced themselves to check the house. They found the other 3 bodies upstairs. Old Cecilia in her bed, Maria Baumgartner sprawled across her mattress, and little Joseph in his crib. The house reeked of death, but it was also clear that someone had been living there. Dishes were stacked in the sink, food had been eaten, beds had been slept in. The killer had been here among the corpses for days. The police arrived within hours, and what followed was one of the largest criminal investigations in Bavarian history. More than 100 people were interviewed, suspects were questioned, backgrounds were checked, theories were proposed and discarded. But despite the massive effort, despite the hundreds of man-hours devoted to the case, the investigators could never determine who had killed the Gruber family. The autopsies revealed the horrific details of the deaths. All 6 victims had been killed with the same mattock, which was found in the barn, cleaned, but still bearing traces of blood. The wounds were consistent with someone of above-average height and strength wielding the tool. Little Cecilia had survived for several hours after her initial injury, lying in the barn, conscious and terrified. That detail alone was enough to make hardened police officers weep. But who had done this? The investigators developed several theories, each more disturbing than the last. The first and most obvious suspect was Victoria's husband, Karl Gabriel. He had officially died in the First World War, but no body had ever been recovered. Rumors persisted that he had deserted and gone into hiding. Had he come back to Hinterkaifeck? Had he been the one living in the attic, watching his family, planning his revenge for some real or imagined slight? The theory had some merit. Karl would have known the layout of the farm, would have known the family's routines. He would have had a key to the house, or at least known where one was hidden. And if he had deserted, he would have been desperate, possibly unhinged by years of living in hiding. But investigations into Karl's whereabouts turned up nothing. If he had come back to Hinterkaifeck, he'd vanished like a ghost afterward. Another suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had been romantically involved with Victoria. There was speculation that he might be the father of little Joseph, though this was never confirmed. Lorenz had been one of the men who discovered the bodies, and his behavior at the scene had been odd. While the other men had recoiled in horror, Lorenz had calmly examined the bodies, even moving them to check for signs of life. Some investigators found his composure suspicious. Had he already known what they would find? Lorenz was interrogated multiple times, but he always maintained his innocence. He had no clear motive for murdering the entire family, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the crimes. Eventually, he was cleared of suspicion, though some investigators never quite believed he was innocent. They pointed out that he knew the farm well, that he would have been strong enough to wield the mattock with fatal force, and that his romantic involvement with Victoria gave him a connection to the family that other suspects lacked. Then there were the drifters and vagrants who were known to move through the area. Bavaria in the early 1920s was a place of social upheaval. The First World War had ended just 4 years earlier, and the country was still reeling from the loss. Thousands of men had returned from the trenches mentally scarred, unable to reintegrate into normal society. Others had never officially returned at all, choosing instead to live on the margins, moving from place to place, working odd jobs, sleeping rough. Could one of these men have taken shelter at Hinterkaifeck, been discovered by Andreas, and killed the family to avoid being turned in to the authorities? It was possible, but it didn't explain the methodical nature of the murders. It didn't explain why the killer had stayed at the farm for days afterward. A drifter killing in panic would have fled immediately, not hung around to feed the animals and eat the family's food. This was something else, something darker. The investigation dragged on for months, then years. Hundreds of people were questioned, dozens were considered suspects, but no arrests were ever made. The case grew cold, buried under new investigations, new crimes, new tragedies. The farmhouse at Hinterkaifeck stood empty for a year before being torn down. The land was eventually sold, and today there's nothing there to mark where the farm once stood. The bodies of the Gruber family were buried in the village cemetery, their graves visited by curious tourists to this day. But the question remained, haunting investigators and true crime enthusiasts for generations. Who killed the Gruber family, and why? Let me walk you through some of the theories that have emerged over the years, because this is where the case becomes a window into human nature at its darkest. Each theory reveals something about what we fear, what we suspect about our neighbors, about strangers, about the very nature of evil itself. The first theory, and perhaps the most frightening, is that the killer was a complete stranger. Someone passing through the area who saw the isolated farm and decided it would be an easy target. This person might have hidden in the barn or attic for days, learning the family's routine, waiting for the right moment to strike. The methodical nature of the murders, the way the killer systematically eliminated each family member, suggests a cold, calculating mind, someone who could plan, execute, and then live among the bodies without any apparent remorse. This theory is terrifying because it suggests that evil can strike anywhere, at any time, for no reason at all. That you could be living your normal life, going about your daily routine, and someone could be watching you, learning your patterns, planning your death. It strips away the comfortable illusion that we're safe in our own homes, that there are rules and reasons to violence. The second theory is that the murders were committed by someone the family knew. Statistics tell us that most murders are committed by someone known to the victim, often a family member or close associate. In the case of Hinterkaifeck, this could have been Carl Gabriel, Victoria's allegedly dead husband, or it could have been Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who may have been Josef's father. Or it could have been someone else entirely, someone with a grudge against Andreas, perhaps over money or land or some slight real or imagined. This theory is disturbing in a different way because it suggests that the people we trust, the people we let into our lives, might be capable of unspeakable evil. That the friendly neighbor or the estranged family member could be hiding murderous intentions behind a smile. It makes us question everyone, trust no one. The third theory, and one that has gained traction in recent years, is that the murders were somehow connected to the occult. Bavaria in the 1920s was a hotbed of mystical and esoteric movements. Secret societies, occult practitioners, and folk magic were all part of the cultural landscape. Some researchers have suggested that the Gruber family might have been victims of a ritual killing, that the strange details of the case, the killer staying at the farm, the methodical nature of the murders, all point to something beyond a simple crime of passion or opportunity. This theory is often dismissed by serious investigators, but it persists because it offers an explanation for the inexplicable. How else do you explain someone staying at a farmhouse with 6 corpses? How else do you make sense of the ritualistic elements, the way each family member was killed in turn, the mattock cleaned and placed back in the barn? If we can't find a rational explanation, perhaps the answer lies in the irrational, in the realm of the occult and the supernatural. But here's what I think, and I want you to consider this carefully. I think the truth of Hinterkaifeck is simpler and more terrifying than any of these elaborate theories. I think someone, for reasons we may never understand, decided to destroy the Gruber family. Not for money, there was nothing valuable on the farm. Not for revenge, there's no evidence of any serious conflicts. Not for some occult purpose, but simply because they could. Think about it. Someone who had been watching the farm, who knew it was isolated, who understood that no one would hear screams or notice anything wrong for days. Someone who had the physical strength and the mental coldness to execute 6 people, including small children, without hesitation. Someone who then had the audacity to stay at the scene, to inhabit the victim's space, to live their lives for a few stolen days before disappearing forever. This kind of killing, motiveless and methodical, is perhaps the most frightening of all because it suggests a type of evil that doesn't follow the rules we use to make sense of the world. We want murders to have clear motives, jealousy, greed, revenge. We want them to make some kind of twisted sense so we can tell ourselves, I would never do that because I would never be in that situation. But Hinterkaifeck denies us that comfort. It presents us with a crime that seems to have no purpose beyond the act itself. The case was officially closed in the 1950s, though it was never solved. The physical evidence was lost during World War II when Allied bombing destroyed the Munich police headquarters. The reports and photographs that might have yielded new insights with modern forensic techniques were turned to ash. All that remains are witness statements, newspaper accounts, and the enduring mystery of what happened on that March night in 1922. But the case refuses to die. Every few years, someone new becomes obsessed with solving the Hinterkaifeck murders. Amateur detectives pore over old documents. Theories are proposed on internet forums. Books are written. Documentaries are filmed. The case has become a dark touchstone in European true crime, a reminder that some mysteries may never be solved. Some questions may never be answered. In 2007, a team of students from the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy attempted to solve the case using modern profiling techniques. They examined all the available evidence, interviewed descendants of witnesses, and applied contemporary investigative methods to the century-old crime. Their conclusion? The most likely suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had been involved with Victoria. They believed he had a motive related to paternity of Joseph and had the knowledge and opportunity to commit the murders. But even they admitted their evidence was circumstantial. Lorenz was long dead, and he would never face trial for crimes he may or may not have committed. Other investigators have focused on the possibility of a serial killer operating in Bavaria during this period. There were other unsolved murders in the region around the same time, though none as elaborate or chilling as Hinterkaifeck. Could the same person have been responsible? Was the Gruber family just one stop on a longer journey of violence? It's possible, but impossible to prove with the evidence available. What we're left with is a story that resonates across time. A family murdered in their isolated farmhouse, a killer who vanished without a trace, and a century of unanswered questions. The Hinterkaifeck murders have become something more than just a cold case. They've become a legend, a dark fairy tale that reminds us that evil is real, that safety is an illusion, and that sometimes the monsters don't just disappear. Sometimes they get away. Think about the last moments of each victim. Andreas, struck down in the barn where he'd worked every day of his adult life. Victoria, seeing her father murdered, trying to protect her daughter, failing. Little Cecilia, lying wounded in the straw, pulling out her own hair in her agony and fear. Old Cecilia, killed in her bed, the place where she should have been safest. Maria Baumgartner, on her first day at a new job, never imagining she was walking into her death. And baby Joseph, who never even had a chance to understand what was happening. 6 lives ended in brutal fashion, and somewhere out there the person who did it went on living. Maybe they felt remorse, maybe they didn't. Maybe they told someone what they'd done, or maybe they carried the secret to their grave. We'll never know. And that's what makes Hinterkaifeck so uniquely disturbing. It's not just the violence, though that's horrific enough. It's the not knowing. It's the gap between what happened and what we can prove. It's the killer who got away. I've spent hours researching this case, reading every account I could find, looking at the photographs of the farm before it was torn down, studying the crime scene sketches made by the investigators. And the more I learn, the more convinced I become that we're missing something crucial. There's a piece of this puzzle that would make everything make sense, but it's lost to time, lost to the chaos of the 20th century, lost to the simple fact that sometimes evil triumphs and justice fails. The families of the victims moved on as families do. Some descendants still live in Bavaria, carrying with them the knowledge that their ancestors died in one of the most brutal, unsolved crimes in European history. The village where the Grubers shopped and attended church has changed, modernized, become just another small Bavarian town. But the memory of Hinterkaifeck lingers like a stain that won't wash out. So what can we learn from this dark chapter of history? Maybe the lesson is that we're never as safe as we think we are, that the locks on our doors and the lights in our windows are just comforting illusions against the darkness that exists in some human hearts. Or maybe the lesson is simpler, that some mysteries resist all attempts at solution, that some crimes escape all attempts at justice, and that we have to live with that uncertainty, that discomfort. The farmhouse is gone now, plowed under and returned to farmland. There's a memorial marker, but it's small, easily missed. Most people who pass by have no idea that this was once the site of such horror. Life goes on. The world moves forward. But the story of Hinterkaifeck remains, preserved in books and documentaries, passed from one generation of true crime enthusiasts to the next. If you've made it this far in this story, you're probably like me, someone who can't look away from darkness, who needs to understand how such things can happen. And maybe that's healthy in a way. By studying these crimes, by refusing to forget, by asking questions even when we know we'll never get satisfying answers, we're bearing witness. We're saying that these victims mattered, that their deaths meant something, even if we can never fully understand what happened to them. Before we end, I want you to do something for me. I want you to think about your own home. Think about how isolated it really is, or isn't. Think about the sounds you hear at night that you dismiss as nothing. Think about the neighbors you wave to but don't really know. Think about how much of your daily routine is visible to anyone who might be watching. Not to make you paranoid, but to make you aware. Because the people at Hinterkaifeck weren't doing anything wrong. They were just living their lives, and someone decided to end those lives in the most brutal way possible. And here's the question I'll leave you with, the one that keeps me up at night when I think about this case. What if you heard footsteps in your attic right now? What if you found strange tracks in your yard? Would you investigate? Or would you do what Andreas Gruber should have done and call for help immediately? How much would you risk to understand what was happening in your own home? The Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved after more than a century. The killer was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. 6 people died horrible deaths, and their murderer walked free. That's the terrible truth of this case. Not the violence itself, as awful as that was, but the fact that evil sometimes wins. That's the real horror story. If this case has affected you the way it affected me, if you found yourself holding your breath during certain parts, if you'll be checking your attic tonight before you go to bed, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Help us bring more forgotten stories like this one to light. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think happened at Hinterkaifeck. Who was the killer? What was their motive? Or do you believe, as some do, that this is a mystery that will never be solved? And if you want to dive deeper into the darkest corners of true crime history, check out our other videos on unsolved cases from around the world. Because Hinterkaifeck, as terrible as it is just one of many stories where evil prevailed and justice never came. The farmhouse is gone. The victims are long buried. The killer is almost certainly dead by now, having escaped earthly justice entirely. But the story remains, a dark legend passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are real, and sometimes they get away. Sleep well tonight, if you can, and if you hear footsteps in your attic, maybe don't ignore them the way Andreas Gruber did. Because the lesson of Hinterkaifeck, if there is one, is simple. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And in this case, that feeling of wrongness, that sense of being watched, that fear that something terrible was about to happen, turned out to be absolutely, horrifically correct. This has been the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, Europe's darkest unsolved case. A century later, we still don't know who did it or why. We may never know. And that, in the end, is the most terrifying part of all.